Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I'm Paul Saunders, the president of the Center for the National Interest. We appreciate everyone bearing with us as we moved this discussion from an in-person to an online event due to the weather today in the Washington, D.C. area. And let me assure you, we do plan to have an in-person discussion on trade. I have a feeling that it will continue to be an important topic in the coming months, and I imagine longer than that. So we're really thrilled to have two great panelists with us today to talk about what to expect from the Trump administration's trade policy, and I hope certainly to share some of their own views about what might be desirable in U.S. trade policy too. We have speaking first, Elaine Dzenski, who is Senior Director and Head of the Center on Economic and Financial Power at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. And Elaine has a long career on international trade and a variety of international economic issues, including at the World Economic Forum. Speaking second, we have Manisha Singh, who was Assistant Secretary for Economic and Business Affairs at the U.S. Department of State during the first Trump administration, the founder and leader of Sunstone Strategy Group, a business advisory firm today. We're really delighted, Elaine and Manisha, to have both of you with us today. Thank you so much for doing it. Each of our speakers will talk for about 8 to 10 minutes. Then we'll throw it open to questions. And as I mentioned, we'll start with Elaine. So Elaine, please take it away. And thank you again.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here, and what a remarkable time to be having this conversation. It feels like we've entered a period where all the rules and norms are being questioned, and I think there's probably a long way to go until we see what the ultimate impact is of even the first few weeks of the new administration. But I wanted to start there in terms of some observations about what we've seen since the inauguration, and at least my take on where things are going, particularly around the trade engagement. So the first thing I'd like to point out is that I think, and I'd be interested in Manisha's view on this as well, I think Trump 2.0 is entirely different from Trump 1.0. Not only are we talking about a different group of people coming into the White House and the administration with different views on what needs to be fixed and how we approach the world. But I think it's also questionable as to whether policies that were priority in Trump 1.0 will look the same. I think we're actually in a different space. And maybe the best example of that is what's happening in the trade space, which looks to me like a complete global reset. And one of the key barriers that I think has been broken, or maybe we call it a norm, is that the administration really isn't making that much of a distinction between allies and competitors at this stage. And with tariffs being used as the opening salvo in a trade reset, it matters less as to the nature of the relationship with the U.S., and it matters more as to whether a country runs a trade deficit or a trade surplus with the U.S. And that's certainly what we're seeing playing out on steel and aluminum. It, I think, is the explanation in terms of why Canada and Mexico are being viewed the way that they are. And we haven't even gotten to Europe yet. We'll see how that goes. China's in a slightly different category because I do think this administration does view China as a strategic competitor. But Will we see a similar approach in terms of where we go with a next round of tariffs, for example, or future economic warfare in the form of sanctions or export controls? To be continued. We may be looking at a much more transactional environment, even with China. So it really brings up some key questions around how we manage and treat allies and partners versus those we might consider to be strategic competitors and even foreign adversaries. So again, we have a long way to go in terms of how all of this works out, but tariffs as an opening shot, that is going to be absolutely important to understand. And understanding some of the underlying objectives of this administration, including what appears to be a real focus on reindustrialization of this country, and what will be required to achieve that in terms of domestic investments, onshoring of certain industries, rethinking engagement with countries around supplies of critical minerals, which is going to be absolutely essential. And ultimately, in this construct of reindustrialization, what does that look like in terms of foreign direct investment coming into the US and potentially from many different sources? That I think will be fascinating to see. I would also point out that we have two interesting threads going right now. One is Elon Musk's focus on finding $1 trillion of savings and starting with USAID as kind of low-lying fruit to bring balance into what this administration feels is a very bloated bureaucracy. And then we have the other piece of this, which is Howard Lutnick and others thinking about how to bring $1 trillion in revenue into this country, some of which will come from a tariff regime, but some of that will come from elsewhere. And that is tied into this notion of reindustrializing this country and bringing more of that balance into the deficit surplus equation globally. So we can go into a lot more detail, but I think I'll actually stop there. Thanks.
That's terrific, Elaine. Thank you very much. I think that gets us off to a very good start and raises a number of interesting issues, Manisha. So I'll turn it over to you, Manisha. We look forward to your own comments, and then we'll throw it open to the audience to discuss.
Well, thank you so much, Paul, and I want to thank you and the Center for National Interest for the opportunity to be on this panel, especially with Elaine from FDD. And Elaine, I have to compliment FDD on all of the great work you do. I read a lot of your papers. I think you all have done an amazing analysis on the Middle East and sort of next steps there. So pleasure to be here with you and share my thoughts on this very interesting topic that I think every day you open the newspaper, there's always something new about tariffs or trade or economic tools being used. And Elaine, I very much agree with you that I think this Trump administration, Trump 2.0, is going to view trade and economic policy in different terms, and the tactics will be different. But I think the one similarity will be President Trump's view that economic policy tools need to be used to level the playing field for the American company and the American worker. I think that that's something he has said since the 1980s and the 1990s when he was sort of a celebrity, a business developer. At the time he talked about Japan. He's been talking about China for decades as a businessman. So that thread that will continue is the Trump administration and all of the people that he's putting into place, the common theme being, how can we do better for the American worker, the American consumer? And let's take a look at all of the tools that we can use to accomplish that, including tariffs, including finding ways to attract foreign direct investment as well. And I always tell people tariffs are one part of the equation. There are some people who I think are trying to draw that direct thread between tariffs to higher prices. Well, as someone who's taken a look at economic policy for decades in Washington, I can tell you, watching the ebbs and flows of consumer prices, it's dependent on many different things. And I think everyone coming into the Trump administration is trying to look at it big picture. For instance, keeping the Trump tax cuts, an effective tax policy is going to matter for the economy. Reducing regulatory burdens. One of the recent executive orders that I just saw was directing Lee Zeldin to look into the EPA to reduce burdens for small businesses. Keep everything that we need for clean air, clean water, clean environment. But I think I had read a statistic that said that the Obama administration added 100,000 pages to the Federal Register. And for those of you who have read Federal Register notices, I mean, that's no small number. It just shows you that our administrative state has grown. So my first point would be to look at tariffs within the totality of circumstances. Tariffs are of course being used as a tool by President Trump as instruments of our foreign policy and national security. We saw that with the potential tariffs imposed on Canada and Mexico, and that brought immediate action. All of a sudden we saw Claudia Sheinbaum commit 10,000 troops to the border. Justin Trudeau, who's on his way out. It'll be interesting to see how Trudeau's successor handles the situation. But again, another attention, an amount of attention that was being paid to the border that was not before. And this is, as everyone knows, this is not just an immigration issue. This is 40,000 pounds of fentanyl coming across the border in different ways. We know that the Chinese are dumping fentanyl into Mexico with the aim of getting it across the border into American cities, into American schools, and that's something that really, really needs to stop. And as far as Europe, that conversation has opened up again. I saw a headline this morning that the EU trade chiefs are now affirmatively coming to President Trump to see how we can work out these cross-border trade issues. The US and the EU is the largest trading bloc in the world. And so it's an important relationship. It's important to have that conversation. And also people need to remember the United States is a relatively free economy. Both our tariff and non-tariff barriers are relatively low. If foreign companies want to invest in the US, they have to go through a regulatory process, but they know what it is. Whereas American companies have had a harder time historically getting into the European Union. And in China, as we all know, there's no transparency. If you get approval to do business in China, you may or may not know why. The Chinese market has always been very difficult for American companies to navigate. And of course, when they get there, they have to worry about their intellectual property. So big picture, President Trump and the new administration, I think, are very much going to look at how can we use every economic tool, including tariffs, at our disposal to level the playing field for the American worker. And I'll also go back a little bit in time. I always think it's important to look at how we got here to understand what the Trump administration is going to do at present and in the future, in the next 4 years, and what I think every future Republican or Democratic administration needs to look at. So let's look at the international trading system. Going back to post-World War II institutions, we set up what I like to call the Bretton Woods institutions. This is the World Bank system. This is the IMF. What started off as the League of Nations, this compact group of countries, became the now sprawling United Nations, which has agencies on everything from environment to women to children to the questionable agencies like UNRWA. So you have this sprawling bureaucracy that's sort of taken over and dips its fingers into economic and trade issues as well, which I always question the reason for that and how effective it is for an organization like the UN to do that. And then, of course, we had the GATT, which turned into the WTO. And I don't think that it will surprise anyone to say at this point, the World Trade Organization, I wonder what they do beyond sort of the day-to-day minutia of functioning the organization. I served at the State Department during the Bush administration as well in the Economic Bureau. And I remember at the time, we were still hopeful that the Doha agenda could come to fruition and it would set about to leveling the playing field for everyone around the world. That was the goal of the WTO. Well, needless to say, I don't think that that has achieved nearly what it was supposed to. So moving forward, we have situations where, again, different countries are able to ship goods here relatively freely. Um, and it's had every president, starting with Ronald Reagan, consider the use of tariffs. People forget. I think with Trump, the way he's using tariffs has commanded a lot of attention. However, people forget that when Ronald Reagan was president, there was a lot of concern about Japan and Japanese electronics coming in. At some point, President Reagan imposed like 100% tariffs on electronic goods from Japan. Subsequently, President Bill Clinton tariffed $500 million worth of goods coming in from the EU in what was known as the Banana Wars. Those of you trade wonks will recall what I'm saying about the Banana Wars. $500 million worth of EU goods, and the Europeans were none too happy. Similarly, President Obama tariffed goods as well. A lot of goods from China were tariffed. And then, of course, coming into the Trump administration and Trump 1.0, he had limited uses of tariffs on steel and aluminum to shore up our domestic industries. President Biden kept many of the Trump tariffs in place. And of course, now we're seeing tariffs utilized in an entirely different manner. And so I just remind people of that, just to say that, tariffs have always been used as a tool. And I think that the reason that presidents are looking to tariffs is because the global trading system has not necessarily worked for the American worker. That's why I make the point about the World Trade Organization. There was a time in history when Pittsburgh was the steel mill, the steel producer for the world. And if you go to some of these communities now, they've been decimated. Manufacturing is gone. In America, what do we make anymore? And at some point, we have to consider the fact that we make very little here, it becomes a national security issue. And this is the thing that I think President Trump is focused on. What happened to American manufacturing over the decades? We let it slip, and there are benefits. I would never say that there are not benefits to the fact, the wealth of nations theory that every country should produce what it's good at and trade amongst each other, and that's the most efficient way to build an integrated global economy. I think that there are merits to that theory, but we're also in a period where, as I've mentioned, the American worker has suffered some of the effects of this integrated theory of trade. And so President Trump is looking at the broader picture and saying, how can we change the dynamic? Will tariffs directly raise prices? I don't know. I'm not going to say that, tariffs are not going to impact prices at all. I will say that tariffs, considered in the big picture, combined with other things like decreasing regulatory burdens, an effective tax regime, getting foreign direct investment, greenfield investment, which can create new jobs here in the US, that balance, I think, is going to work to the benefit of the American economy and the American consumer. But Paul, as you started by saying, I think it's going to be an interesting year and an interesting 4 years. And with that, maybe we can get some questions from the audience.
Great. Thank you so much, Manisha. I think also a lot for us to think about and talk about. So I'll encourage everyone in the audience with us here today. If you do have a question, please use the Q&A tab at the bottom of the Zoom screen to submit that online. I would encourage you, if you can, to try to identify yourself as you ask a question so that I can convey that information to our two panelists and to the audience, who the question is from. Let me start off maybe with one question, however, myself, just to get the conversation rolling a little bit here in a provocative way. You know, Elaine brought up the distinction between our allies and our adversaries, and how I think Elaine asserted that President Trump is kind of less attentive to that distinction, you know, than some others might be. And of course, the reality is, you know, that our alliance relationships are built on fundamentally on shared security interests. Our allies are security allies. But at the same time, you know, when we look at an economy, particularly like China's, you know, massive state-owned companies, huge scale, very tough competition. You know, it's not always easy for American firms to be on a level playing field. And is it something that tariffs actually can even address entirely? But because of this considerable difference in scale. So I wonder if the two of you might talk a little bit about this kind of tension between, on one hand, you know, there being considerable advantages in trying to work together with our allies to contend with China, but on the other hand, the challenges that we face because we're kind of competing economically with China and also with our allies at the same time. I'd welcome a perspective from each of you on that, and we have actually three questions that we can from the audience to turn to after we address that one.
Great. I'll jump in on this because I think you're getting to the heart of the question. And what I think Trump is saying is, if you're an ally of the US, then prove it. I think that's the new reality. And it is very much in the economic domain. And if you look at what this administration has done over the last few weeks, it's an economic playbook. So that is the environment that we're in, which is probably not a bad thing because we have tremendous economic power as the United States of America, as the consumer of first and last resort. So I think that there's a deliberate strategy to you know, tap into that in a meaningful way. But going back to this notion of if you're an ally, prove it, that is what I see behind a lot of this sort of opening conversation around tariffs. So are you an ally with us on combating fentanyl and cartels and crime? Are you an ally in terms of access to critical minerals? Are you an ally on immigration? Are you going to help us solve some of these problems? And are you going to help us address this trade deficit surplus challenge? So is this a good way to start the conversation? Actually, I think it is. There's certainly some collateral damage in terms of organizations, countries who are kind of sticking to an old set of ways of engagement, which now look very different. But ultimately, I think what's happening is this push towards using American economic power, and as Manisha rightly points out, through a tool set of very interesting approaches. It's not just tariffs, it's sanctions and export controls and CFIUS review and protecting innovation and other things. But behind that is the objective to create or recreate a free and open capitalist system where we can play by rules that reinforce capitalism and the system that we know needs to be the backbone of global trade. So I don't think it's wrong to reassert that leadership, particularly in the economic realm. And, you know, if we look at how it's worked out for us over the last 5 decades in the military space, a lot of what we've done has backfired over the last years. So so this is a different approach. I think we're going to be in this economic realm. It doesn't mean that there isn't the threat of military might and engagement behind this, but we are in an economic moment. We are also the consumer market for the world. And this is the core of American economic power, and why the imposition of tariffs actually matter, and why sanctions can bite, and why export controls can bite, and the like. So we will see, I believe, more pressure to exert our engagement on areas of strategic interest. So we've already seen that. We need the Panama Canal, so we're exerting pressure. We need the Arctic, we're exerting pressure. We need Russia to back off Ukraine, we're exerting pressure. We need fentanyl to stop, we're exerting pressure. One thing that I've written about extensively is this concept of ally shoring, which kind of morphed into the friendshoring concept of the Biden administration. And one of the questions that I get is there a future around this concept for ally shoring? I ultimately think we may end up there, but the entry point looks different now, and it's about getting parties to the table to reach alignment, and making some threat that if we can't get there, there will be a cost to that. So we may end up seeing more alignment on a North American strategy for combating fentanyl, for dealing with immigration, for addressing Chinese dumping, challenges around transshipments and rules of origin, and all the problems that we have with China in particular as a non-market actor, pushing its surplus and its non-market behaviors onto the U.S. and North America. So the challenges are there, they remain, but the approach is looking a little bit different. So I'm somewhat optimistic that we may get to the right place, and as a result of that, we will see the foreign direct investment flowing into the U.S. for sure, but hopefully out of the U.S. In a way that reinforces economic security and, to some extent, our national security priorities.
Thanks very much, Elaine. Manisha, your thoughts on this kind of tension that we have with our allies between our security interests and at times our economic interests at times.
I would agree very much with what Elaine has said. And Elaine, I love your economic playbook thought, because I think that's exactly what it is. You know, we have this playbook where we have to look at what's coming from both allies and adversaries. And one of the things I would say about the American economy is when the American economy is strong, the rest of the world is strong. You know, when the what is the expression? When the U.S. economy catches a cold, the rest of the world gets the flu. You know, so we do have to look at what's happening here in the U.S. market. And I think our allies, our European allies, will understand that. They will understand that President Trump needs to look at what's going on here in the U.S. first. And I do think that although some of the conversations and maybe some of the tactics being used are similar, regardless of the status of the countries with respect to the United States, I do think that the posture is different. You know, we know that both President Biden and President Trump have viewed China and treated China very differently, because they are not just an economic threat to us, but a national security threat. When it comes to the European Union, you know, we're having a conversation. And although they're allies, that doesn't mean that our companies are not having a difficult time entering into the European Union. This has been the case for several decades now. I remember looking at policies that purported to be phytosanitary or protecting the environment, but in effect, their treatment was poor for American companies to enter the actual European market. Very recently, when I served in the first Trump administration, there were several European countries that imposed a digital services tax. And they said, no, this is not just towards American companies. It's being applied applied broadly. But if you looked at it, the companies that were actually subject to this digital services tax were companies like Meta and Google and Amazon. They were American companies, these great American innovators, which were being subjected to these European regulatory burdens, which made it harder for them to do business in the EU. So as far as allies and adversaries, I think the goal here is just to look at opening markets around the world and figuring out what's going to work for American companies, and ultimately, stronger companies, companies like Google and Amazon. This is one of the things that I pointed out to my European counterparts when I talked to them about the digital services tax or data localization. Google employs thousands of people in Dublin, Ireland, where, Ireland has made it, presented a favorable tax climate for US companies. But a lot of these companies employ people in countries around the world. US tech companies employ lots of people in India. And so the conversation on allies and adversaries, I guess some of the tactics are the same, but the way that it's viewed and that the solutions ultimately are in their interest as well.
Thank you very much, Manisha. So we have several questions, actually 7 questions from our audience. So we have 7 questions and 33. Sorry, 27. We're at 12:33. We have 27 minutes left, and I might have 1 or 2 other things in my back pocket to ask. So I'd encourage kind of short answers as we try to move through here. The first from, and everyone forgive me with pronunciations, the first from Hans Mohiman Siriban from the Embassy of Philippines, who is asking how the administration can justify steel tariffs vis-a-vis Mexico in a situation when Mexico's steel imports from the U.S. actually have been growing in recent years. Any thoughts from either of you on that point?
I'm happy to venture just a quick answer on that. I think that that's part of the conversation that the Mexican government is going to have with the incoming Trump administration. The 232 steel and aluminum tariffs are being applied broadly. And in the first Trump administration, there was a process for exemptions. There was a process for going to the Department of Commerce and United States Trade Representative, USTR, saying that, this production of steel or aluminum constitutes a national security issue. So certain countries had conversations, and I'm not aware of that fact from Mexico. But if that is the case, then I think the Mexican government will have that conversation with incoming Trump administration.
Terrific. Thank you. Anything to add, Elaine? Or it looks like you may agree. I saw a nod.
Excellent answer. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much. So now we have a question from James Kim at the Korea Economic Institute, who asks, the speakers have suggested that tariffs are not only about trade and rebuilding manufacturing, but what about national security concerns related to China? How did the tariffs connect to that?
Well, I think the blanket 10% tariff was the opening move and saying, hey, we're not happy with the non-market practices. We're not happy with the dumping of products into our market. And we do recognize that China is very much a strategic competitor. So I do think the national security angle is there, but the kind of the opening round, if you will, took a slightly different kind of frame. Does that mean that we won't see a renewed focus or a deep focus on the national security implications of the U.S.-China relationship? No, I think that there's just more to come in this space. But there's also the potential that it could look very different. I think we may see a more transactional approach with China. But what's really important, at least from my perspective and the research that we're doing, is to go hard on stopping the non-market practices, because that's the kind of parasitic behavior that ultimately threatens the global trade environment. It's trying to operate within a free market rules-based system when there are key players that are undermining that. It just doesn't work. So we really have to get to this concern as an economic security challenge that is really driving the tension between the U.S.-China relationship.
Thanks, Elaine. Just for the benefit of our audience, you mentioned the non-market practices in China's case. If you could give maybe 2 or 3 examples to make clear what you have in mind.
Sure. So I'm talking about massive subsidies across supply chains and certain industry sectors. We've done a lot of research into the lithium ion supply chain, for example, which is the technology at the core, not only of EVs, but also of energy systems, drones, computers, cell phones. I mean, there's many, many applications. But if you look at the vertical integration of the lithium ion supply chain, most of which is dominated by China, through critical minerals processing and the production processes kind of in the midstream of this supply chain, you see that it's almost impossible for us to compete. It's the scale and the scope of the subsidies combined with this vertical integration and the government engagement, right? We're not talking about dealing with private sector companies. We're talking about organizations that are very much controlled by the CCP versus our free and open system. It's almost impossible, right, to compete in these emerging supply chains without a complete rethinking of how we do that. And so that's one example of the market manipulation that I'm talking about. But there are other examples, whether that's using forced labor to keep labor costs low, skirting rules of origin requirements, and using transshipments to evade tariffs and export related issues, setting up in Chinese operations, setting up in North America to take advantage of the USMCA, be treated as a North American entity. The list goes on and on.
That's great. Thank you very much. I just wanted to make sure that everyone understood what you had in mind there. And Manisha, thank you for your patience. National security. Your thoughts on national security.
Well, I think, one of the things that the first Trump administration's national security strategy set out was that economic security is national security. And I think that theme is going to continue throughout this administration and be deepened. The Chinese like to say they have one belt, one road. And of course, we have many belts and many roads. We have many relationships to manage around the world. The China equation is the most complicated one. Elaine did a great job of laying out non-market behaviors. And those go back to the fact that, we tried to solve these within the World Trade Organization. I don't think that's a viable forum for us anymore. So now we've got to look at bilateral solutions.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So now we have a question from Craig Allen, who has been recently the head of the U.S. China Business Council. He's asking about what the president has said recently about reciprocal tariffs, reciprocal trade. You put a tariff of X on our product, and we'll do the same to you. Are there any other countries that use that model? What do you two think about that approach? And again, we'll try to keep concise here so we can move through the questions.
Well, I'll give a short answer to that. I mean, I'm sure every country has the right to determine how it's going to respond to tariffs imposed by the U.S. But, I think people should keep in mind the US is the largest economy in the world. As Elaine said, we have the largest consumer base in terms of buying power, and China has benefited from Americans buying Chinese goods for decades now. So I think that that's something that different markets should consider as well, is that the US consumer likes and wants to buy goods from all over the world. Um, I think President Trump has made clear that if there are reciprocal tariffs imposed, he will respond in kind. I wonder, though, if that will be the first move of the countries being subjected to tariffs. As I mentioned earlier, I saw a news report this morning where EU officials are already lining up to meet with the incoming Trump administration to solve the problem beforehand. So my prediction is going to be that, like Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico and like Justin Trudeau in Canada, they will come to the table. And I think that's part of what President Trump is using the tariffs, this toolbox for, is to say, look, these are serious matters. We're not able to get your attention otherwise. So let's talk about the economics of the situation, and then they'll come to the table. And it seems to be happening so far.
Yeah, I would
Elaine, anything to add? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
That's okay. I completely agree. Again, it's tariffs as the kind of opening shot here to reset the relationship and reset the terms of discussion and engagement. Some will argue that the best response to imposition of a tariff is to do nothing at all. And I think in some cases, that's probably right. Although the best scenario is that, we're being clear about what it is that we want. That's important. We have to tell Canada and Mexico what it is that we expect. What is it that we're trying to fix? And what is the pathway to either avoid that or reduce the implications? Or if we can't get to agreement on that, then maybe it's the imposition of the tariff. But that is really the question. What is it that we want from these relationships? What are we asking for?
Great. No, thank you for that. So we have a couple of different questions from Ruth Schipper at the Netherlands Embassy here in Washington, D.C. One of them actually links a little bit, Elaine, to what you were just saying. And Ms. Schipper is asking, why would our allies be using the trade agenda as a way to try to get concessions in areas that aren't related to trade, to moving outside of the lane? Doesn't that kind of damage our economic relationship? Shoot that in the foot a little bit. And then she had a separate, unrelated question, pointing out that the United States actually has a surplus in the services trade, and the U.S. economy, like many of our European allies, have these service-dominated economies. What are the things that we need to do to kind of help workers, in economies that are increasingly service economies, to be working in, maybe some of the key manufacturing areas of the future, automation, et cetera. So a couple of different ones there. And again, brief.
Elaine, do you want to take the
Manisha,
first
yeah,
part of that
well,
question? I was going to say maybe Elaine could take the first part. I can
sure.
second part.
That sounds good. So Elaine, you on using trade tools for non-trade things, and then Manisha, if you want to take the industries of tomorrow and retraining question.
Sure. So I think what we have to recognize is that we're just in a completely different paradigm here. And this administration is using the levers of trade and economic power to reset relationships on a variety of fronts. This is the new space that we're in. So I would view it less as, why are we shooting ourselves in the foot, and more about what is the ultimate goal of this reset that this administration is looking for. And we've talked about some of the parameters and aspects of that, but I just think we're in a different moment. And if we try to apply an old frame to a new game, it will not be understood.
Thank you. Thank you, Manisha.
Well, on the services question, I think that's a little separate and apart from tariffs, although I guess somewhat related because, as we were discussing earlier, the manufacturing sector has been one of the worker groups that's been hardest hit by this integration of the global economy. I think that the services sector presents new opportunities with all developments in artificial intelligence and robotics. President Trump has talked about the cryptocurrency industry. I think this administration is going to be very forward looking when it comes to technology. And the question will arise, how are we going to equip workers to be able to compete and innovate in this new economy? And I think that that's something that each administration in the Netherlands, of course, Mr. Prime Minister Geert Wilders, of course, is going to have to take a look at that as well on how do we equip people starting at school age to compete in this new economy. I'm optimistic that the incoming Trump administration is going to be positive on this and is going to find a way to make sure that every part of the economic spectrum is able to compete in the new economy.
Thank you very much. Now we have a little bit of a provocative question from Robert Manning at the Stimson Center, who's asking, what does a bilateral trade deficit have to do with being an ally? Don't we want the United States just to have sort of an overall rough balance between imports and exports? And does it really sort of matter that much if one specific country is out of balance with the United States? And he's sort of adding, the president seems to have an idea, that tariffs are going to fund the budget deficit, but isn't that really kind of out of sync with the scale of the deficit?
Well, I don't know that the president thinks that tariffs are going to fund the budget deficit. I think he has said that tariffs are, a tool that we're going to use to achieve some of our national security objectives, and they can potentially be a source of income into the U.S. Treasury. Because one of the ways to stimulate the economy is, of course, tax cuts for the middle class, which are going to increase spending power. And then, we know the economic equation from there. And other things that he's looking at are things like foreign direct investment, which increases our economic relationships with our allies. And I think as far as trade deficits, a lot of people have opined on that the United States doesn't want to have these insurmountable trade numbers with a country like China. But even with countries who are our allies, I mean, the trade deficit is what contributes to things like inflation and ultimately the day-to-day costs for the American consumer. I mean, the last I checked, like you can find the debt clock on the internet somewhere, it just keeps moving. $37 trillion. That's not sustainable. If we don't manage that now, what does our country look like 10 years from now in its financial situation? So I would contend that it is a problem.
Elaine?
Yeah, I agree with that. There are certain countries that are driving this deficit, China being principal among them, but we also have significant deficits with Germany and certainly with Mexico and Canada. Now, we could argue that the value of the engagement and the allied relationships and partnerships supersede those deficits. at least with the last three that I mentioned. Not sure about China. But I think that there's just a fundamental difference in terms of how this administration is looking at this deficit surplus challenge, and that it needs to be right-sized, and that they're going to go after many different ways of reducing that deficit. And I think there's something important behind that, which is it's really difficult when we become the consumer of last resort and first resort. We also become and have been the safe investment for foreign reserves, which means we're absorbing a lot of surplus into this country. It makes it very difficult for us to be competitive across industries. It makes it difficult for us to have a balance between a service orientation and sector and make enough of the stuff that we need at home so as not to have dependencies and vulnerabilities, particularly on adversarial and competitor regimes. So there's a whole conversation around that dynamic, that macro trade dynamic, and ultimately what that means. Now, I don't think that tariffs are the solution to that. It's an opening shot, and there's a short-term role for tariffs to help reset that. Ultimately, we have to get back to domestic policies around what it is that we want for our economy and for our future. And that will require some additional structural shifts to get us there. So I think it's a very complicated topic. We're at the early stages of this. But again, I feel somewhat optimistic that if we can start to address some of these massive imbalances, we may ultimately find a pathway for us and for our allies and partners that is ultimately more sustainable.
Thank you very much, Elaine. So we've got 3 questions left here, and I want to ask you two to be a little bit provocative at the end. We've got 7 minutes, very fast. So Kimberly Reed asked a couple of different questions. Your thoughts on kind of how the president is approaching the relationship between the Commerce Secretary and USTR. And then also thoughts on Exim Bank and other tools like that. Has anything really changed since the first Trump administration in terms of using those tools as we compete with China? And then lastly, we have a question from Lindsay Posmanic from the State Department. What about using trade as a human rights tool? Do you see any hints that the administration might try that?
Well, I think I can take the Commerce and USTR and Exim one. I'm a little bit familiar with that. And I also want to mention that Kim Reed was an excellent president of the Export-Import Bank, throwing that out there. I think that the relationship between Commerce and USTR is going to be a collaborative one. There's many questions that have arisen whether the USTR is going to report to the Commerce Department. I think that's immaterial. I think that there's a partnership. Jameson Greer was, of course, the chief of staff to Bob Lighthizer, who was USTR in Trump 1.0. And he gave a very interesting talk on 60 Minutes. I think it was the week before last. So if anybody's interested, pull up the Bob Lighthizer interview on 60 Minutes. He talks a lot about tariffs, and it addresses many of the questions that have been posed here today. But I think that there's a collaborative approach between Commerce, Treasury, and USTR. President Trump has made clear this is the economic policy in the beginning. And as Elaine has mentioned, this is starting out. This is the place where we're starting. Tariffs are going to be a tool that are fully utilized in the beginning. And there's a shared jurisdiction between USTR and Commerce on many of these issues. And the Treasury Department, of course, is going to be very, very interested as the banker for the United States government. So I think the important thing to remember is that all of the players are going to be working together, and President Trump is going to be setting the economic agenda.
Thank you, Manisha. Elaine, any very brief thoughts on that or on the question of human rights leverage?
Yeah, just quickly on the first question, I think the the use of EXIM, the Development Finance Corporation, the potential for a sovereign wealth fund. I mean, all of the thinking around how to exert more economic engagement and secure supply chains and meet national security objectives is front and center. We will see more in this space, more innovation. What form that takes, I have no idea. But I think EXIM is, in principle, a really important thing to preserve and advance, along with the principles behind DFC and being able to take equity investments that achieve national security goals. On the human rights question, this is a fascinating one. And we could have an entire conversation just on the kind of the debasement of the human rights agenda over many, many years, and how it morphed into something that is almost unrecognizable. And that is why the UN human rights conversation is just so irrelevant and needs to be completely rethought or maybe moved elsewhere. But I think what we can do is align on some of the basics. I think we can all agree that slavery is really bad. We can all agree that child labor is unacceptable. We can all agree that poor working conditions that injure workers and create vulnerabilities for populations is unacceptable. How do we address that? Well, we certainly don't address it by allowing China to continue using forced labor. We don't address that by allowing the authoritarians to use non-market practices in ways that circumvent these basics. So at the end of the day, if we're committed to rethinking this open rules-based system in a way that has benefit for everyone, I think we can get to some of those questions. But it's problematic to think that the human rights agenda, as it currently stands and has been effectuated over the last decades, is getting us to where we need to go.
Thanks very much, Elaine. So let me ask just
Paul,
a quick
can I
one.
just add to that real quick?
Sure,
Sorry, on human
please.
rights, just
Yeah,
30 seconds. I would agree with Elaine on the human rights agenda, and also point out that President Trump just sanctioned officials at the ICC for the way that they've been operating. I mean, just to say that this court, the way that they've done prosecutions, were prosecuting legitimate governments rather than the terrorists, that's problematic from a human rights perspective globally.
All right. No, thank you for that, Manisha. So let me ask, and we might run 1 or 2 minutes over. I apologize to our audience for doing that, but I want to ask one question here at the end, kind of to challenge both of you a little bit and see what you have to think. So I think there might be many in the United States today, who would express a concern about erosion of the rule of law in the United States. And if we see that, do either of you feel that there could actually be risks to some of the inbound investment that the president hopes to encourage? Bearing in mind that, if we're kind of constraining investment by our adversaries, and there are good reasons to do that, and we're kind of looking to our allies to do the investment, are there any dangers there?
Well, Paul, I'll start off with a brief response to that. I am a believer in the U.S. institutions and the process. CFIUS has gone through several iterations. It's been reformed and it's been updated to make sure that national security is followed while open investment is permitted in the United States. I think we come up every once in a while, we find certain sets of circumstances where a particular investment might be an overall consideration in our national security, where the investment maybe doesn't go through. But the United States has one of the most open investment systems in the country, and transparent. The other thing I will point out, that if an investor feels like they have not been permitted to invest in the US and they followed all the laws, followed all the regulations, they can go to court. There is normally an appeal process. Contrast that with China. As I said in the beginning, even if you are permitted to go in, whether it's selling consumer goods, setting up services, being a government contractor with state-owned enterprises with the Chinese government, you may not even know why you were allowed, just that you were. Similarly, if you're denied access, you're not necessarily given a reason. And then if you do operate in China, your intellectual property is at risk. Not just American companies, but foreign companies have said to me that they don't do any more of their research and development in China anymore. When it comes to the US following the process, it's transparent and it's appealable. Foreign parties have access to United States courts, whereas if you go into China, even if your investment or your services are approved, you may not know why, just that they're approved. And certainly if you're not approved, you don't get a reason, there's no appeal process. And if you do business there, your intellectual property is at risk. I've had US and foreign companies alike say that they no longer do their research and development in China because it will cost them billions of dollars in theft.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you. Elaine, final thoughts.
Sure.
Just American domestic investment climate.
Yeah. So I'll just echo the transparency point. That the market doesn't work without transparency. And the system, the global trading system, is suffering because of a lack of transparency. It's opacity around the mechanisms that are being used to subvert the rules of the game, right? So we have to be careful that we continue to maintain a level of transparency, particularly as the bureaucratic structures of government go through some fundamental shifting. The more that we can be transparent and open about those changes, why they're needed, what they're accomplishing, the better. Both in order to bring people along in terms of what those changes are and why we need them, but also to maintain that level of transparency to continue to attract the kind of foreign direct investment that is actually critical to the objectives that we're trying to meet. So yeah, transparency is really the key.
Thank you so much to both of you for a really fantastic conversation. Thank you to our audience for sticking with us for a few extra minutes to pursue that question. We look forward to having a number of additional conversations on trade and trade policy over the course of the next several months. And I hope that all of you will join us again for that. So, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.